Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to those here in LA, and for those of you who may be logging in from out of town. My name is Jen Maxey. I'm the Director of Public Programs at Holocaust Museum, LA. We are so honored to be presenting a conversation tonight with Richard Hurowitz to talk about his new book, In the Garden of the Righteous. For anyone who hasn't visited the Holocaust Museum, LA, and I hope that some of you have, and if you haven't, we hope to see you there. We are the oldest and the first survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the country. And so we're here to preserve memory, honor those who perished and those who survived, and we hope to inspire greater humanity through truth. We serve tens of thousands of Los Angeles area school children every year, many of them from Title I schools. And since we're situated in the heart of West Hollywood, our visitors hail from all over the world, representing the diversity of Los Angeles. We're very proud to be at the forefront of helping to combat bigotry, anti-Semitism, and discrimination in all its insidious forms. And we do this by both celebrating all cultural identities and telling the stories of the Holocaust that remain relevant reminders of both the best and the worst aspects of humanity. Tonight, we're here to talk about some of the best of humanity. The righteous individuals chronicled in Richard's book risked their own lives to save those in peril during the Holocaust. Each of the individuals profiled in this book have been recognized among the tens of thousands of righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem in Israel. Those who were not themselves Jewish, but who chose not to stand by and allow the atrocities of the Holocaust to stand without taking action. Richard Hurowitz, who we're thrilled is with us tonight from New York, is an author and an investor whose writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, to name only a few. Richard sits on the governing board of the Yale University Art Gallery, his alma mater. He also received his law degree from Columbia and is the co-founder of the Renew Democracy Initiative. Richard is the founder and CEO of Octavian and Company, an investment firm. And joining Richard tonight is Tom Teichholz, an award-winning journalist who also happens to be the founding curator for an annual Holocaust film series, the Teichholz Film Series, that is presented by Holocaust Museum LA, and which begins this year in just a couple of weeks on July 20th. So please do check our website for all those films. We have 5 wonderful films, hmla.org. We'll give you more details on that. So I just want to let you all know we're going to leave some time for some questions. You can put those in the Q&A function. Hopefully we all remember all of this from the pandemic, the Q&A function. Tom will take a look at those questions after Richard and Tom are done talking. So without further ado, Tom and Richard, take it away.
Thank you, Jen. And welcome to all of you. Thanks for tuning in to this conversation that the Holocaust Museum LA is sponsoring. Richard has written an incredible book called In the Garden of the Righteous, and you will be able to buy copies of this book by contacting the email, the book manager who will be in the chat. And actually, we've arranged that you will be able to purchase signed copies because Richard will send signed book plates for each of the books that you purchase. So be sure to do that. It's great. Now, Richard, let's just begin by what set you on this journey to tell these stories?
Yeah, well, so I actually start the book with the answer to that question, and it's I'm not from a family of Holocaust survivors. My wife's mother actually came here as a 1938 from Germany, but my family's been in the United States for a long time. So it wasn't, we were fortunately in the United States. But when the Holocaust Museum opened in Washington, in I guess it was 94, I was in college at the time and I was studying history, and I went down to see the exhibit like a lot of people did with my family. And there was just this, anyone who's been through that exhibit, and as I've been talking about the book, everyone seems to remember, this pile of shoes that still stays with me, many of them children's sizes, right? And, 1.5 million children died during the Holocaust. And the whole exhibit there is really intentionally meant to be obviously very, very upsetting and traumatic. And when at that time, when I came out, there was a small exhibit of rescuers, and I was actually drawn in particular to, actually, it's on the cover of my book, to this guy right here. So his name was Alexander Schmorell, and he was about the same age I was at the time, and he was a medical student. He was part of a group called the White Rose that some people may have heard of, and they were basically students who tried to foment an uprising against the Hitler and the Nazis, and they did it.
Non-Jewish students.
Yeah, sorry, they were everybody I'm going to talk about for the most part is not Jewish. So they were young Jewish students. The main founder of the group was Hans Scholl and his younger sister Sophie, and they actually were, in one of their leaflets, which they circulated leaflets all over Germany they were based in Munich, but to other universities, and actually as far as Vienna. And their second leaflet, which was written by Schmorell, was actually one of the first documents to publicize the Holocaust. They said at this time, there have already been several 100,000 Jews killed in a bestial manner. And they tried to appeal to everybody, particularly young people, to say, this is not the Germany we know. And they were successful in circulating these leaflets for almost a year. And then, they were captured at one point at the University of Munich by a maintenance man who was an ardent Nazi. And within days, Hitler had flown in his favorite judge from Berlin, and they were executed. And Sophie Scholl had a comment where she said at the trial, everybody thinks like we do. They're just afraid to say it. But of course, this is not true. They were very, very, unique. And interestingly, in Germany today, everybody knows who they are, because this is what they want to present as kind of, the best of this period of time. But the story always stayed with me. And then a number of years later, on the 75th anniversary of their execution, I wrote an article in the New York Times about it, just a memorial piece on the op-ed page, and it went completely viral. And it went, it trended to the top of the articles. It was shared, hundreds of thousands of times. And there was no commentary, which I found remarkable, that was sort of anti-Semitic or pro-Nazi, which, the internet's a pretty dark place. And it seemed to really strike an inspirational chord. So I started writing up other similar stories of people who actually rescued Jews in the Times, in the Journal, in the LA Times. I had an article about the King of Morocco in the LA Times that went to #2 on Reddit, which means it was seen by probably tens of millions of people. And some for the Daily Beast. And then I turned them into this book, because the more I got into the story of rescue, I find them very inspirational. I think there's a lot we can learn from the rescuers. And I also think that that Jewish people in particular, but the world in general, kind of owes them a debt of gratitude. And, many of them, which we can talk about, suffered for what they did. And I think there's a historical injustice that everybody knows who Heinrich Himmler was and Hermann Goering, but very few people know the name of Irena Sendler, who saved 2,500 Jewish children and babies from the Warsaw Ghetto, risked her life every day, or Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who saved 30,000, I think as many as 30,000 people. So other than Raoul Wallenberg and Oskar Schindler and maybe the rescue in Denmark, these are really unknown stories, and yet they're largely, these are among the most amazing, heroic people who ever lived. So there were reasons that they were, the stories have been undercovered, but which we could talk about, but that was sort of the initial. So I can trace the inspiration back to college, but then, more recently, this kind of, the reaction I got to starting to tell the stories was pretty powerful. Oh, I think you're on mute, Tom. Sorry.
So often when we imagine these rescuers, we think of young people like Sophie Scholl, who are single, without children, sort of free to be brash and courageous because they're not risking the livelihoods of their family members. But as we see in your book, that's not always the case. Let's talk a little bit about Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who who certainly had a large family. Tell us a little bit about him.
Sure. I mean, when people ask me, who's your favorite? and there's a couple. He's definitely one of my candidates, but he as I mentioned, is pretty unknown. But I did write an article about him for the Times as well. So he was an aristocrat who was he was born in the 19th century, and he was from an aristocratic family, and he was a twin, and his brother was sort of the they both went into the foreign service under the monarchy, actually, and the brother was the very sort of buttoned up, very serious, and eventually became the foreign minister under Salazar, who was this sort of the dictator of Portugal. And Aristides was more of he was a very good diplomat, but he was more of a bon vivant. So he was a really good entertainer, entertained everyone from Einstein, to just had incredible people throughout. And he was posted all over the world. He was in Zanzibar, he was in Brazil, he was actually in San Francisco, and he ended up having 14 children. So I think you were making that point.
Yes.
And there were a few rescuers in my book that had many, many children. And
he had a special bus for them. I love that.
He did, yes. And there's a picture of it in my book. He had to actually, they eventually found themselves in Antwerp, and they were tour all over Europe, and he actually had this special bus built that could seat all of the children, and it was it was a customized vehicle. and he also, in front of his ancestral home in Portugal, he would fly the flags of all of the different places that his children had been born, which were, because they were born. He had a couple of children that were actually American citizens, because they'd been born in Berkeley, California, when he was posted out there. And so anyway, he, when he was in his 50s, he found himself as the consul general in Bordeaux, and which was down near the border. And in June of 1940, when the Nazis invaded France, there was probably there was a mass exodus of millions of people to the south, because the south was where, two reasons. I mean, that's where the government had fled to, but also everyone was trying to get out, and the best place to get out was over the Pyrenees to Spain. And if you could get to Spain and or Portugal, they were neutral, and many people you could leave from Lisbon off into the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, and so he was there. But the issue for the refugees who then kind of swarmed into Bordeaux was that in order to exit, you needed a number of papers, one of which was an exit visa, and people were going around from consulate to consulate out, including to the United States, and absolutely nobody would give a visa. And Sousa Mendes was really like a great humanitarian, and he was also very religious. He believed he was actually descended from conversos, but he was a very, very devout Catholic. And he came out. There was a sort of crowd, and he'd sent most of his children back to Portugal. So it was only his two oldest boys, and his wife was there, and his nephew. And he came out into the square, and there was a rabbi who was there with many children as well. And Sousa Mendes said to him, "Why don't you come? You don't sleep in the street. Come spend the night in the consulate. We have a lot of room." And so the rabbi came, and they spent the whole night talking. And Sousa Mendes he had already. So sorry to back up. I apologize. Salazar, who was the dictator of Portugal, was absolutely adamant that Portugal not be pulled into the war in some way, shape, or form. And because of that, he was adamant that Spain not be pulled into the war. Franco, he was sort of an advisor to Franco, and given the devastation that had happened during World War I, and given the Spanish Civil War, his paramount foreign policy goal was neutrality. And he was kind of this Machiavellian character, sort of amoral. And later in the war, he would switch to the Allied side. But he had sent out a circular to all the diplomats earlier, basically saying that none of the consulates were to give visas, particularly to foreigners and Jews. And so Sousa Mendes had already by this point actually given visas to a couple of people and been reprimanded. But now this flood arrives. And when the rabbi was with him at the end, he said to him, is there anything I can do for your family? Maybe I could give you visas. And the rabbi said to him, well, I can't leave all the other Jews out on the street. I can't, it would be wrong. And so Sousa Mendes has a very dramatic moment that he talked about and which he said was akin to a nervous breakdown. He took to his bed for 3 nights. Wow. And then when he woke up, he came out and he made this very dramatic announcement. And he said, I'm going to give a visa to every single person who wants it, regardless of religion. And then he proceeded to do.
It's a race against time because he was
right. So what was happening was there was the as soon as the armistice was going to happen, or the Portuguese actually caught him because Salazar got wind of this and sent a number of very senior diplomats to try to catch him. And he was actually also going to other parts of the south of France where he had other diplomats that reported to him, Sousa Mendes. And he ended up giving out, thousands of visas, many of them to poor Jews, but also to people like the people who wrote Curious George, who were actually carrying the manuscript with them. He saved the Habsburg family, not Jewish, but they saved a lot of Jews, very much the target of Hitler, who sent a paratrooper team to try to arrest them. The Rothschilds, Paul Rosenberg, who was Picasso and Matisse's art dealer, Salvador Dali and his wife. So they think that during basically 3 weeks, Sousa Mendes did the single biggest rescue by an individual in the entire Holocaust. And for his efforts, he was summoned back to Lisbon by Salazar, disciplined, put on, basically there was a hearing. He was stripped of his position. He was, the findings were actually to reprimand him, but he was overruled by Salazar himself. He was forced into retirement. He had his pension cut in half, and then he basically went through all of his life savings. His children couldn't get jobs in Portugal; they had to leave. He was reduced to the Jewish community. He would not take money from anybody he rescued, and to be in fairness to them, many of them didn't even know who he was or wouldn't find out for many years. But the Jewish community in Portugal and Lisbon actually would feed him and his family at the soup kitchen. And one day there was actually a teenager that I quote in the book who saw this very elegant, aristocratic man come in diplomatic garb with very threadbare clothing. And he said to him, we have 2 parts of this establishment. There's the part for refugees and there's a part for Portuguese. You should go there. And Sousa Mendes looked at him and he said, we're all refugees. And his wife died prematurely, and then he died prematurely. And before he died, actually, he was very frustrated because Salazar ended up actually taking credit for a lot of being at the end of the war for all the refugees that came to Portugal. And it wasn't until much later, actually, the United States recognized him before Portugal did. But after the sort of Salazar fell in the 70s, there started to be some thought about it, but it wasn't until the 90s that he was rehabilitated and given the honor of being a well, he was made an ambassador. Israel actually recognized him first, and he was made a righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem, and a tree was planted in his honor. But the Portuguese themselves finally, he's now a national hero in Portugal, but very unknown. And again, he times as many as Oskar Schindler did, and again, died in obscurity.
One of the things that struck me in this book, and it's something that actually they make a big point about, sort of in the Ken Burns' U.S. and the Holocaust, is that this was a time when a piece of paper meant life or death. And
Yes.
a lot of the rescuers that you chronicle are essentially providing.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Tom. Sorry.
Life-saving pieces of paper, and it's quite kind of startling that life or death came down to that.
Yes, it did. And, there are, an unusual number of diplomats who helped people. But when you actually look at the number of diplomats who didn't help people, it was quite, they were quite rare too, because they happened to be in a position to help people. There are other people in my book talking about pieces of paper. There's paper through, actually, now that, it's interesting you bring that up, because I hadn't really thought about it, but there was also a lot of counterfeiting that went on.
Yes.
So there were a lot of people who risked their lives to make false identity papers for people. Irena Sendler, the woman I mentioned who went in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto, actually kept a list of the Jewish babies they would go in hiding under non-Jewish names, and she kept a list of their Jewish name on the hope that they would be one day reunited with their parents, or at least brought up Jewish. And that paper, she almost died at one point trying to save that piece of paper. So yes, these piece of paper was, and Dorothy Thompson, the journalist, actually had a very, quote, I quoted it in my book, and then it is in the Ken Burns documentary, about how piece of papers were what, made the difference between life and death. And the US was not good on this. And actually, I have one chapter on Barry Fry and Hiram Bingham.
And Hiram Bingham, yeah.
He was in Marseille. He was one of part of Fry's network that saved many of the most famous artists and writers. Many of the artists came here to New York. Many of the German writers actually came out to Hollywood and became screenwriters and just expats writing there. He was Bingham, whose father was the one who discovered Machu Picchu, who was a horrendous anti-Semite and bigot. But his son was this had 11 children, but the son really had a great humanitarian spirit and gave visas to many people, including poor people that he broke out of got out of the camps in France. He actually visited the camps and wrote a report for the United States government that was ignored, as well as people like Marc Chagall and others, and he hid a number of them in his villa. But he was really the exception. And at that consulate in Marseille, other than him and another guy there who worked for him, it was a descendant of Miles Standish. His name was Miles Standish. That was it. And actually, in the end, he was basically bounced out of the Foreign Service, and Fry was expelled. If you saw the Netflix movie series, they completely changed the story, and the end of it was completely wrong, because in fact, Fry was expelled from France at the behest of the United States government.
Yeah, so the State Department is not the hero in any of these stories.
No, we were terrible. We never filled our quota. I think that, I thought the Ken Burns movie was excellent. I think it gave a little bit of a free pass to FDR, but the real problem was, Breckinridge Long, who was the person who was in charge of visas. And he had been our ambassador to Italy, and he was very enamored with Mussolini, and he was very anti-Semitic. And he basically there's directives he gave to people to just delay and delay and delay and try not to give, visas. There was a sort of view on the ground in France that the Germans were going to win the war, and no one was sympathetic to the Jews. And so you had absurd things where people were, afraid Jews would be German spies, right? And I actually came across a story. I mentioned it briefly in my book in passing, but I wrote about it for the Journal. It was 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, the entire Parliament of the Virgin Islands, which was under the administration of the Interior Department at the time, Harold Ickes, who was a great guy. They voted to allow any Jews to come there. The governor at the time was a Columbia academic, and it was, you can imagine what the Virgin Islands would have been like if this had happened. And and they wanted them there, and yet the State Department and the War Department kind of conspired to block it, and they brought it up to FDR himself, and they pulled him out of the swimming pool, and he said no. The one U.S. territory that actually really distinguished itself was the Philippines, where you had a team effort of the governor general. The last governor general was a guy named McNutt, who was a governor of Indiana. He was a rival of FDR's, so he sent him as far away as possible. And then Manuel Quezon, who became the first president of the Philippines, they actually worked with some local Jewish businessmen from Ohio. They brought over 2,500 Jews from Germany, and Quezon actually wanted to bring 1 million Jews to the island of Mindanao. Wow. And they were, after the famous Evian conference, the Philippines was one of the few places that would allow Jews in, Dominican Republic being another. And unfortunately, it didn't happen because the Japanese invaded. But so it's sort of also a very unknown story. I mention it in passing. When I sent in my book proposal, there were supposed to be 15 stories, and then realized it would be like longer than Proust. So we had to cut back. But
we've talked a little bit about these diplomats who the extraordinary exceptions. But what's amazing about the book is that there were rescuers from all walks of life, including a Greek Orthodox statesman, I guess you would call him, that you have a chapter about.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and an Italian national hero of a cyclist.
Yeah.
And in both cases, both were very religious people who believed in a law greater than the one they were seeing being carried out by the fascists.
Yes, it's interesting because so two places that get a very, that people are rightly critical of is the Catholic Church, although I think it's not a monolith. And in fact, there were many heroic Catholics and many heroic members of the Catholic clergy, which I talk about. And then in Greece, let me start with Greece, as you mentioned it first. Greece was the worst outcome for any country in Europe in terms of percentage of Jews who survived. It was like 95% of the Jewish population was murdered. But there were really two kinds of Greek Jews. There were the Sephardic Jews who were in Thessaloniki, Salonika, and they had really only become part of Greece during the kind of Balkan crisis, when there had been a swap. So like 20 years earlier, of Muslims and Orthodox, and before that, it had actually been a city state. It was a majority Jewish, and there was actually it was all three religions, and there was a thought of actually having it be an independent city state, and it would have been under majority Jewish control. And both David Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky spent time there because it was sort of a model because the Jews were not just like the scholars and the bankers, they were like the dock workers and the laborers and the taxi drivers, and they said this is like what a Jewish state could look like. But those Jews really were, they had this very distinct Sephardic culture. In the rest of Greece, there's the Romanotes, and this is a third kind of Jew besides the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim. And they were Jews that were in Greece since the time of Alexander the Great. They looked Greek. They spoke Greek without an accent. Their children were all named Greek names, and they were really considered a part of this of Greece. And so the other thing that happened in the south of Greece, where they were, which is in Athens and the islands, was that it was initially the Italian zone. And one thing that I talk about a lot in my book is that the Italians did not really, they didn't do roundups. They thought there was, other than the very hardcore cadre of fascists, they really didn't have what they called the German disease, the anti-Semitism, and they certainly weren't going to kill Jews. So if you were in an area of Europe that was occupied by the Italians, including Italy itself, you generally were safe as a Jew. I mean, there might have been discrimination, they might have put you in a camp, but you would not have been in danger of being killed. After 1943, when we invaded, we toppled Mussolini when we invaded Italy, and the Allies basically got all the way up to right south of Rome, and the Germans came down and put Mussolini back in and occupied the north of Italy. And that's when the Italian Jews and the Jews in Italy were in danger, and that's when the Jews that I'm describing in the south of Greece became in mortal danger. And what happened was, the man you mentioned, Damaskinos, who was the Archbishop of Athens, which made him the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, he gave a directive. First, all of the leaders of Greek society came together to send a letter to the collaborationist prime minister and to the German governor general protesting the treatment of the Jews, and he was the first to sign it. And then he was friends with the chief rabbi, who he got smuggled out, and then he sent a directive to all of the what they call metropolitans, specifically the priests and the clergy and the nuns, and to do whatever they could to save the Jews, and to tell their congregants to do whatever they could do to save the Jews. And then actually equally heroic were the municipal workers and the chief of police of Athens and a lot of the civil society, who the church would give a baptismal certificate, and the police would give a identity card under a false name. And they ended up saving many, many Jews, and it was a very different outcome. And there was actually an island called Zakynthos, which goes back to Homeric times, and there they had 100% survival rate. They saved every single one of the Jews was hidden by their neighbors. Those are interesting stories we can talk about these places where everyone was saved. You mentioned Gino Bartali, the cyclist. I mean, he's my other candidate for favorite. He was an amazing story, because this was a man who was probably among the most famous athletes in the world, certainly in Europe at the time. And he had won the Tour de France in 1938. And Italy at the time was cycling mad. It was
no Italian had ever won before.
Yeah, and well, there'd been one, and and that one died in mysterious circumstances for being anti-regime. What happened was, sports were extraordinarily important to Mussolini. He presented himself as a sportsman, and the Italians had they had come in second in the gold medal count in 1932 Olympics, which were held in Los Angeles, where you are. They were the hosts of the World Cup, and they won the World Cup. Primo Carnero was the heavyweight champion of the world. All of those athletes dedicated their victories to Mussolini. And when Bartali won, he was an anti-fascist. He hated politics. He did not like the fascists. He was very devout, and the Catholic Church was really the only other institution besides the fascist party that was could maintain its like a loyal following. It was very hard for the fascists to challenge it. And so when he won the Tour de France, he dedicated it to Mary, and he went to a church in Paris, and the police and the secret police noted this in his file, and there was it said that he didn't, he kind of mumbled, and he didn't mention anything about Mussolini, and he just thanked his fans. And when he came back to Italy, there was a French journalist came with him and was shocked, because here he won the Tour de France, and there was nobody waiting for him in the train station. So he was sort of persona non grata. And this was in the period of time before the war. When the war happened, he was drafted. He was allowed to, he was basically a bicycle messenger, but instead of using a motor scooter, they let him use his bike so he could stay in shape. But really, during the war, there was no cycling. And then after 1943, as I mentioned, when the Germans came down, he did a few things. He hid a family that he knew were acquaintances of his that were Jewish in the basement of his apartment in Florence. So he hid a family of 4, including 2 children, during the occupation. He also hid a Jew and a Roma in a bicycle shop he owned with his cousin. So he was hiding Jews, which was, largely, could have subjected him to summary execution because the Nazis themselves were now in Italy. And then he became part of what was known later as the Assisi Underground. And there had been an organization in Italy called De la Sem, which was organized by Jews to basically take care of Jewish refugees. And the Italians were fine with it because it dealt with the refugee issue, and it was funded mostly by American Jews, and the regime took a commission. It was like a money-making scheme for them as well. But when the Germans came, the Jewish community had to go underground, and the Catholic Church, many of them were friends, they took over. And so you now had the Archbishop of Geneva, the Archbishop of Florence, the Bishop of Assisi, many people in the Vatican and Rome basically took over this effort of dealing with the refugees. And then what they started to do was hide Jews and partisans and soldiers who had basically been demobilized. And Assisi became a center for hiding. This is like where St. Francis is from. It's a religious city. They don't think any Jew had ever lived there, but all of a sudden you had hundreds of Jews that were being hidden in monasteries, in convents, and even in the cloisters. And we were talking about papers earlier. A big part of this was having false papers. And Bartali's spiritual mentor and his personal priest was the Archbishop of Florence. I mean, he was a celebrity and he knew the Pope. And so his bishop is this Archbishop is his family priest. And his name was Cardinal de la Costa. He's also been recognized as a religious among the nations. And he was one of the key members of this Assisi Underground. And he recruited Bartali into it as a courier. And Bartali, if you think about it, was one of the few people in Italy who could ride around in his uniform without rising suspicion. I mean, and he also had the physical ability to ride hundreds of miles in a day. So he could go from Florence to Geneva to Assisi. And he would take, in addition to getting information for the underground, he would take false papers for Jews and put them in his bicycle under the seat or in his handlebars. And when he was stopped, people would be very excited, but he would say, like, don't touch my bicycle, it's perfectly calibrated. And people would say, don't touch Bartali's bicycle, you're going to cost him the tour. And then he would do things like once showed up at a train station, and it was as soon as he showed up, everyone swarmed him. The German officers were distracted, and in the back, they moved Jews from one train to the other and down to safety. There was a great story where he was a counterfeiter who was almost caught by the Germans in Assisi, and he ran to the monastery where there was a father who was was basically Bartali's handler, and he was going to resign, and he saw this young cyclist, and then Bartali got on it, and he said to the guy, he said, "Was that Gino Bartali?" And he said, "Yes, but you can't tell anyone." And the guy said, like 40 years later, he said, I could not, I was so inspired to be part of something that Bartali was part of that I couldn't, I couldn't quit. And towards the end of the war, by the way, Bartali was arrested and taken in for interrogation by a very, very sadistic fascist guy. And he only escaped torture and possible execution because one of the people who was there had been his superior during when he was a bicycle master. He'd actually been the guy who allowed him to ride the bicycle. And this fascist torturer basically had said he thought that he was smuggling. He had gotten a thank you note from the Vatican for he had donated food, and he was trying to explain it, and the guy was convinced he was smuggling weapons, and this guy dramatically steps out to know if Bartali, he doesn't lie. And so they had to let him go. But his son said was the most frightened he'd ever been. And then the other thing is Bartali, like many of the people in the book, never told anybody what he did. He didn't want to talk about it. He confided in his son, and he said to his son, and there rumors came out immediately in the Jewish community and then out, and there was a book written that sort of implied it. And he would always say, I don't want to, it takes away from it if you talk about it, if you talk about someone else's misfortune. I want to be remembered as a cyclist. And he told his son, maybe one day you'll know when the time is right, but certainly wasn't in his lifetime. And he has this wonderful quote where he said, some medals they give you for winning a race, and it goes in a museum, and other medals you get in the next life, and they're pinned to your soul. And that's how he viewed his rescue activities. And so the only people he ever really talked to about it were his son and a couple of the other people who'd been involved with it. And then at one point, actually, the sister-in-law of the chief rabbi of Florence, he confided in, but he really didn't talk about it. And whenever he was asked about the war, he just would change. He didn't, and he was a celebrity, so it did come up. And I've seen tapes of him sort of trying to say,
and it's striking because, we know of the Vatican's inaction, and we know of the post-war, the church's involvement in the rat line and the path for Nazis to escape from Europe to South America.
Yes.
So it's quite a contrast.
Well, it is. And I think, a couple of things on that. I mean, I think part of it was a function of who was the Pope at the time. I mean, Pius XI, his predecessor, was very close to coming out with a statement denouncing Nazi persecution of Jews, but he died. And actually, Bartali's mentor, Della Costa, was somebody who was considered a candidate for Pope. And if that conclave had come out with him as Pope, you would have had a different story. But the thing I learned is, there's certain patterns you see. And one is that many rescuers, they believed in something bigger than themselves. And very often it was religion. And Damaskinos, who you mentioned earlier, is actually the only head of a church, a formal church in Europe, to denounce the Holocaust. But the people who were interested in religion for sort of hierarchical reasons or for, external shows of piety tended to be the same way diplomats that just wanted to follow orders did not distinguish themselves. But people who really took to heart the teachings of, I am, love thy neighbor as thyself. I think the parable of the Good Samaritan actually saved more Jews than anything else. And the people who really believed that internally and had faith, and also believe that this is, there were people in my book in France, a sect called the Darbis, who believed the Jews were the chosen people, and they considered it an honor to save them. But just that kind of, belief, which is across many religions, of taking care of your neighbor, that was actually really powerful. And so there were a lot of people who were Catholic, who and Protestant and Muslim. Albania is the only country in Europe that had more Jews at the end than in the beginning. The people who took those teachings really to heart, that was probably the single biggest inspiration for rescue.
So we've talked about individuals, but also in your book, there are groups of people, like the people who live in Le Chambon, a French village, that worked together to rescue the Jews that were there, and of course the Danes. So these are also yet a rescuer need not be a solo person. It can be a group of people.
No, that is correct. And what many people know the story of Denmark, where I tell it in my book, and 95+% of Danish Jews survived. They were, it was, the tip-off actually came from a member of the German government who was a member of the Nazi party, but not an anti-Semite, but had very close, he tipped off the Danish government. And then almost as one, the country evacuated their Jews to Sweden. And even the Jews that were captured, there were about 400 or 500 that were sent to Theresienstadt. The government would check on them regularly. They insisted on being able to send inspections. They were sending them food and medicine, and only 50 ended up dying. And so famously, when the Jews came back to Denmark, people had watered their plants, they'd fed their dogs, they looked after their businesses. And so it was highly, highly unusual. And there were reasons for that, but it was from the king down. I mentioned Albania actually was a similar story. It was a haven. Le Chambon is a fascinating story. It's a town in the mountains in the sort of southeast of France, and it has a very long tradition of themselves. Well, they were themselves people that were persecuted. They were Huguenots that were persecuted by Catholics. So it's a very Protestant area in a very Catholic country. And there was a pastor who was from an wealthy family in the north. He actually spent time in New York. He actually met his wife in New York, who was an aristocratic Italian. And they were both Protestants, and they were very, most of their postings had been in cities. And he was one of the foremost believers in nonviolence. It was knew Gandhi, was very, very involved in it. Later, Martin Luther King, and this was very controversial at the time, and he had a lot of trouble getting a posting. So he was sent to Le Chambon in the middle of nowhere, because that was the only job he could get. And when he got there, I've spent a lot of time talking to his daughter, who was 14 at the time. She's total recall. I mean, she corrected me on the color of the rug in her parents' house. Wow. And he, with a number of there were about 14 other pastors that were all across the plateau there. They ended up, it was a place also that people before, that they always they welcomed refugees. So there was people from the Spanish Civil War there, but also it was a place where there were people would send their children for summer camp in the summer. And so there were these homes that were there for children. And he had found it. He literally, while this was going on, they were founding a school, and there was the public school. And he went to go volunteer when the war broke out with the Quakers in the camps in the South. And one of the American Quakers says, actually what you really could be helpful is we can get some children out, but we don't have a place to put them. You can be the place of refuge, the city of refuge, like in the Bible. And so over the course of the war, and it's a very long, dramatic, interesting story, they saved about 5,000 people, including 3,500 Jewish children. They hid them, they smuggled them to Switzerland, but many of them were lived in plain sight, and they gave them I interviewed some of them. They gave them a real.
We have some in LA.
Sorry.
We have
some. Yeah. They gave them a real semblance of a normal childhood. When there were roundups, there was one terrible roundup, which I talk about, but they would send the children into the forest to pick mushrooms, and there's all these photographs of, they went to school, including up to like a college that they had started, and people who were there at that time remember not being scared. And what was kind of fascinating about it was also, at one point the pastor had to go into hiding, and it was an hotbed of resistance. Camus actually was nearby for part of it. It's where he wrote The Plague. But the Nazis were, the Germans were there. There were a number of German soldiers in the town convalescing, and they didn't care, which was true with a lot of people in the Wehrmacht. But you had also Klaus Barbie nearby, the butcher of Lyon. And there were terrible massacres at the end of the war, and but somehow this village, even though people knew about it, it managed to do this during the war. And I think, one of the lessons from a place like Denmark, and even looking at, and I wrote an article about this when the book came out for the Wall Street Journal, is that you do have instances where the entire community stood together and the Nazis backed down. And you had more than one place where the survival rate was 99 or 100%. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that. And a lot of things had to come together for that to happen. But even in places, because it's not realistic for everybody for us to think that all of us would be rescuers, because when you think about, as you said earlier, could damage your livelihood. And in some places in Europe, they would kill you. In Poland, they would kill you and your family. That's asking a lot of somebody to do that. But there's a quote from a rescuer in Holland who was one of those people, who said that what really made their rescue successful was that all of the people, for the most part, around them were sympathetic. So they would look the other way. Whereas the further east you went, the more likely people were to turn you in, either because they were virulently anti-Semitic, they were petty and wanted to get rewards, small rewards. They were taking advantage, but there was a lot. And so the community and its view of it also led to higher, maybe not 99, but like higher survival rates. And I think there's a lot to learn from that, because I don't think we're going back to the Holocaust, but I think even this whole like anti-bullying campaign actually is important, because if you have a community where, you know, more than half of the people say like, no, this is wrong. It's wrong to be, you know, cruel to people. You know, that makes a difference. And there've been 40 genocides since World War II. So the idea that we talk about never again is, I think, a bit of a, you know, we're not there yet. We're not there yet at all.
Now, I just have one or two more questions, but I want to remind everyone who's listening, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will try and field them and answer them. Also, if you want to purchase this book, you've only heard some of the incredible stories in it. There are many, many more, and they're all worth knowing. They are the examples that that stand out in a sea of hatred and inaction. And I guess that would be my next question. We talked a little bit about this when we were speaking on the phone yesterday, but you know, when we read your book, you know, at the same time, it is striking how many people helped in how many ways, but it's also important to remember, as you mentioned in the introduction, that these people were the exceptions.
Yes, they were very much the exceptions. So, you know, 27,000 people have been honored by Yad Vashem, order of magnitude, which sounds like a lot. They have very stringent criterion. I mean, you have to really risk your life or career. You can't be Jewish. You had to have had eyewitness testimony. You know, I like to give an example. I don't know the right Los Angeles analog, but if you filled Madison Square Garden with a representative sample of the European population at the time, which was about 500 million, you'd have one person who was a righteous among the nations. Yeah. And I believe, like, you know, a lot of people helped. There were, you know, these don't include people who died, you know, who were unsuccessful rescuing and tried to rescue and were caught and executed. It doesn't capture the people like Primo Levi talked about how when he was interned, there was a laborer named Lorenzo who brought him soup every day. And he wrote, this man kept him alive because he knew that there was somebody out there that still viewed him as a human being. That guy is not going to be in the 27,000. But even if you multiply by, you know, 100, you're still talking about, you know, like vanishingly small percentage.
Yeah. And again, I think we're getting to a place where our conception of resistance is getting broader. We're understanding that there were all kinds of resistance by all kinds of people, but nonetheless, there were roundups and denunciations and
I think you know, there was, you know, and you know, one theme, not everybody, but many of the rescuers suffered after the war. We talked about Sousa Mendes. I mean, Oskar Schindler had rocks thrown at him in the streets of Germany, and he was in a litigation because a man called him like a Jew lover and he hit him. And then the guy sued Oskar Schindler, and Oskar Schindler had to pay him a fine. And, you know, there were many of them were very modest about what they did. I mean, it's kind of eerie. They use the same language. They said, like, I didn't do anything special. But it was also
like when you watch the Nicholas Winton story.
You know, he never told anybody and saved 667 children. You know, one of the other things, though, is I think, you know, well, behind the Iron Curtain, there were reasons because, you know, there was still institutional anti-Semitism and people were, you know, you could be punished for being or having been a rescuer. Also, they were assumed you were with the Allies. But a lot of people didn't understand it. And they said, well, like, why did you help the Jews? Everyone hates the Jews. And they like, just because the Allies won the war, it didn't end anti-Semitism. And they also said you could have brought, gotten us in trouble. But I think the real reason that people didn't like the rescuers is because it's very difficult to say, I couldn't have done anything when you have somebody who lives next door to you that did something. And so they were very resented. And then the stories were also very undercovered for many years because, first of all, most of the rescuers didn't talk about it because of this kind of universal modesty. I also think rescue itself is very traumatic, and it wasn't something they talked about. And then the first generation of sort of survivors were very conscious that there not be a distortion of the record that, most people were, and the part of us that is dark was interested in evil and the perpetrators and the bystanders much more than the rescuers. So it wasn't until the generation of like my friend Abe Foxman, who was a hidden child, and there was a very well-known rabbi actually in California, started to say we need to honor and understand these people's stories and thank them. Because for Yad Vashem, from the beginning, one of its core missions is to honor the righteous. And Golda Meir, when she dedicated the Garden of the Righteous, talked about how the Jewish people owe a debt of gratitude forever to these people. They were, I think they were drops of love in an ocean of poison. So there were reasons why, again, they were really it was decades before anybody even started to know their stories, and they're still coming out. I mean, the Bartali story only came out in the last 10 years. Yeah. But we can never lose sight of the fact that it was extraordinarily rare. And the purpose of my book is not to say something different. For every, book like mine, there's 1,000 that talk about rightfully the dark side of the Holocaust. And I'm not, but I also did try to spend some time in the book trying to tease out lessons about why people did this and what we might be able to learn to kind of, create a more altruistic, society.
So lay it on us. What can we do?
I mean, I think so we talked about religion. I mean, most of the rescuers, there was only one systematic study that was done by Freudians who were Holocaust survivors, and their only conclusion was that how you were disciplined as a child was important, whether you were disciplined in an authoritarian, irrational way, or whether it was in a loving way. That's not that satisfying, but I think what they get at is correct, which is almost every rescuer that I studied, and I've looked at hundreds now, had some figure, usually a parent or both parents, as a child who did a couple things. One is that they taught them, not to be, they exposed them to the other. Some people did, unlike themselves, and taught them not to be prejudiced against them. And they also were generally people that came out of loving homes. Because if you think about it, to be a rescuer, you really had to have very strong, outside of a place like Denmark, you had to have very strong self-esteem because you were doing something very different than what everyone else was doing. I noticed patterns of, like, again, people believing in something bigger than themselves, often religion, but could be liberal democracy. It could have been, there was a code of hospitality in Albania, people in creative professions. There's one in a circus. People who are in like that, who are also in touch with a lot of people from other cultures. That's why diplomats were often, international exposure made a big difference. But again, I think the single most important thing is how you are as a child. But
I also think that there's a quality that some of the rescuers have, where they have a particular mind that sees a problem and wants to solve it.
Absolutely. And I think I mentioned this to you, a couple of months ago, I sat with the man, if anyone has seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, who the main person who saved 1,600 people. And I spoke to him for 2 hours. We sat together at a dinner, and it was eerie to me because it was exactly like I was talking to one of the Holocaust rescuers. Every question he asked, I asked him about his parents, asked him about his religion. And then I said, like, how did you, he's very modest, never took credit. And I said, like, how did you do this? And he's like, well, I just did what had to be done. And he meant that in two ways. One was like, I don't view myself as a hero, but also he was like, I just problem solve, like constantly. I was just constantly figuring out in the moment what I needed to do this. And like, I don't think he said, the other thing about the rescuers that's very interesting is they're not saints. So these are not people
Yes,
like Mother
right,
Teresa or Albert Schweitzer who
right.
set out
Oscar
to be,
Schindler, not a saint.
no, but even they didn't even
Yeah.
set it, like they did not devote themselves to like some people did, like Irena Sendler was a social worker, but many of them, I mean, guy was running a circus, or this guy was a professional athlete, and they found themselves in these situations. And I actually found really interesting, I interviewed a lot of the children. I had the opportunity to speak to a lot of the children of rescuers, and it was a mixed, response. Like some people, like Hiram Bingham's children, view him as a saint. Varian Fry's son told me his father was completely bipolar and was not a good father and was kind of violent. Even the people in Le Chambon, these like iconic figures in the nonviolent movement, their daughter loves them. She's 95 years old, but she still mentions that, they like, she would never have expected them to come to her piano recital. They were too busy saving the world. So she's
Right.
still upset about it. And so I actually found that, there were people who had illegitimate children. There was a member of the Nazi party who basically saved all the Jews of Denmark. So I find that really interesting because, you don't have to be a saint to do something really heroic. They were really not. They were ordinary people who were flawed like everybody. And in some ways that makes it, to me, like more powerful because it could be anybody.
Yes. But, again, you have to be someone who's willing to do things.
Yes, they were definitely people who took action. And that again, I think goes to what I was saying about people who had confidence in their own abilities. They believed they needed to take action, that there was something wrong going on. Sometimes it would be joining a network, and sometimes it was somebody showing up at your door, and it could be somebody you knew, or it could have been a stranger. Like there's a whole spectrum, but you're right. It was a mix of someone needs to do something here, and I can do it, and I feel capable I can do it. There wasn't, and that means you have a certain kind of inner strength that and sort of ability to think for yourself and have confidence in your ability to do something, and that a lot of that does come from, to the extent it comes from anywhere, not genetic or person, like like early childhood and where you grow up and who models for you is, I think, a big part of that.
Yeah. I'm just gonna. There's no specific question. Someone recommends the film Weapons of the Spirit about Le Chambon. Pierre Sauvage's movie is definitely worth watching on that subject. There is a Sousa Mendes Foundation.
Yes, which is an amazing organization. I know both of Pierre's movie is great. He's in the process of remastering it, and was a great source for my for the book. The Sousa Mendes Foundation is based here. It's actually on Long Island, and they're amazing, and they do a lot of stuff on rescue, and they screen films, and they're dedicated to his honor, but also just to rescue in general. And one of the things I've learned from this book and from writing about these rescuers is not only will I find out, so like you take someone like Sousa Mendes or like these mass rescuers, or like the Japanese consul Sugihara saved several thousand people. There's tens of thousands of people alive because of this. And so anytime I've written about it, I'll find people reach out to me. And the spooky thing is that inevitably I'll find out there are like several people I actually know who
You didn't know this about them.
No idea, and it's pretty amazing. And they're still looking for people like Sousa Mendes. They have a database, but they're still finding people that didn't know they were rescued by him. It was a chaotic situation, right? And people, if you imagine, like, I don't know, you go to the consulate, you meet a Portuguese guy for 3 minutes and probably don't remember his name, and you come move to the United States, you just like things get lost to history. So
right, and your children don't know because they just know you came through Portugal or wherever.
Yeah, I mean,
but anyhow, this is a good place for us to end our conversation. I want to thank you, Richard. I will remind all of you that you can order the book through email the person in the chat, or just go out to your local bookstore and buy it there, but it won't necessarily be signed by Richard. And it's really a great book, well written, very readable, and very inspiring. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and I welcome, anybody who wants to reach out. I always love to hear from people. And Tom, thank you, and thank you, Jen, for having this. And I look forward to seeing you all in Los Angeles. And this was wonderful. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Richard. And for all of you, please go to the Holocaust Museum LA's website to see future events we have coming up, including the Holocaust Remembrance film series that will be starting on July 20th. Thank you, Richard. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.